The photograph was taken on a grey afternoon in the autumn of 1891. 13 sisters stand on the stone steps of a convent that most people in the county had already begun to forget. Their habits are pressed. Their hands are folded low against their waists. The light falling across them is soft and ordinary, the kind of light that makes any photograph feel safe. For more than 100 years, nobody looked at this picture too closely. It sat in a drawer, then a wooden crate, then a forgotten storehouse behind a shuttered diocesan office where the roof leaked and the mice ran freely. And then one evening, holding it up to a stronger lamp the way you do when you are only half paying attention, I noticed the eyes. Every sister on those steps has eyes the colour of wet coal, not dark, not shadowed, black, completely, deliberately black, edge to edge, with no white and no iris and no small point of light where the sky should be reflected. 13 women, 26 eyes, and not one of them is looking away from the camera. That was the night I stopped sleeping properly, because the deeper I dug into this convent, the more I understood that the eyes were not a flaw in the print. The eyes were the entire point. And somebody spent a great deal of effort making sure that you and I would never get to stand in front of that picture and ask why. Before we go a single step further, I want you to do one small thing for me. Open the comments right now and type the word sealed. Just that one word, sealed. I am asking because most people who find a video like this watch the whole thing in silence and then drift away, and this is not a story that rewards drifting away, so leave your word down there. Let me know you are here in the dark with me. And then stay close, because what I am about to show you about these 13 women only grows stranger from this point forward, and the black eyes are only the front door. Let me tell you how the photograph came to me, because the way an object survives is often the first clue that something is wrong with it. I work with paper. That is the plainest way to describe what I do. I am hired by estates and by dying institutions to sort through what is left behind before the skip lorry arrives, and to decide what has value and what does not. Most of it is nothing. Church bulletins, water-damaged ledgers, boxes of hymn sheets swollen shut with damp. But every so often a thing turns up that should not exist, that was supposed to have been burned or shredded or quietly lost, and it survives only because some clerk long ago was too tired or too frightened to finish the job. The Convent photograph was one of those things. It came out of the estate of a diocesan records office in a town I will call El Hollow, a low, wet, unremarkable place in the flat country north of the old canal. The office had been closed for decades. When I opened the storehouse door, the smell told me half the story before my eyes adjusted. Mould, cold iron. And underneath that, faint but unmistakable, the sweet chemical ghost of old photographic collodion, a smell that should not have been that strong in a room full of ordinary parish paperwork. There were 4 crates marked for destruction. 3 of them held exactly what you would expect. The 4th had been nailed shut, which is not something you do to hymn sheets. It took me the better part of an hour to lift the lid without splitting the wood, and when I finally did, the photograph of the 13 sisters was lying face up on top, as though it had been placed there for whoever came last. Under it were maps. Under the maps were letters, and at the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth and then in wax paper and then in a strip of altar linen, was a single glass negative, the original plate from which the print had been made. Somebody had gone to enormous trouble to keep that plate safe and hidden in the same crate they had marked for burning. Think about what that means for a moment. Somebody wanted this destroyed, and somebody else, working in secret, wanted it to survive. The nailed lid was the compromise between 2 people who could never say aloud what they were fighting over. I took the print home first. That is when I saw the eyes under the lamp, and I will be honest with you, my first thought was the ordinary one. Retouching. Old photographers painted on their prints constantly, blacking out a stain, sharpening a jawline, adding a catchlight to a dead man's eye, so he looked alive for the grieving family. I assumed some clumsy hand had darkened the sister's eyes for a reason lost to time, so I did what I always do. I put the print under magnification, a jeweler's loupe first and then a proper stereo microscope, and I went eye by eye across all 13 faces, expecting to find brush strokes. I found none. The black was not sitting on top of the emulsion. The black was in the emulsion, part of the original exposure, baked into the silver at the moment the shutter opened in 1891. These women were photographed with black eyes. Whatever happened to them happened before the picture was ever taken. And then I found the thing that made me put the loop down and walk out of my own house for a while. Because a truly black eye, a solid one, does not reflect anything. It should be a flat, dead absence. But in each of those 26 eyes, when I pushed the magnification as far as it would go, there was the faintest suggestion of a shape, a pale, curved thing rising against a lighter ground. At first I thought it was dust on the lens or a defect in the century-old silver, so I compared it eye to eye, sister to sister, expecting the defects to be random. They were not random. In every single eye, in all 13 women, the same pale shape appeared in the same orientation. A great domed building with a tower to one side, standing on a rise, catching a light that was coming from somewhere the photograph itself does not show. The sisters were not simply staring at the camera. They were reflecting something, the same something, a building. And when I laid the print beside every map of El Hollow I could find, every survey, every parish plan, every drawing going back as far as the records allowed, I could not find that building anywhere. It was not there. It had never, according to every official document ever produced about that town, been built at all. Before we move on to the second photograph, stop for a second. What you just heard about the reflection in the sisters' eyes is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original glass negative. The mirrored building, the blackened irises, it's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. To understand the building in their eyes, you have to understand the convent itself. And here is where the first crack appears in the official story. According to the diocesan records, St. Wendrada's convent was constructed in the year 1840. That is the date carved into the small bronze plaque beside the door in every photograph I have of the front elevation. 1840. A modest date for a modest house of God, except the building in those photographs is not modest, and it is not from 1840. Anyone who has spent time with old architecture can feel the wrongness the way you feel a wrong note in a familiar song. The stonework is too heavy. The foundations sit too low in the ground, as if the earth has risen around them over a very long time. There are windows at the base of the walls that are half swallowed by soil, windows that once looked out at eye level and now stare into packed clay. The doorways are enormous, far larger than 13 sisters would ever need, sized for a congregation that no small rural order ever had. And above the main entrance, worn almost smooth by weather, there is a second date stone, older and deeper than the bronze plaque, and the numbers cut into it do not read 1840, they read 1681. Sit with that gap, 1681 to 1840, 159 years unaccounted for. The convent that the church claims to have built in 1840 was already standing, already old, already sinking into the ground under the weight of its own history, more than a century before the church says the first stone was laid. I am not the first person to notice this. I found a survey letter in the crate, written by a diocesan clerk named Aldous Merrow in the summer of 1863, and Merrow noticed it too. He measured the foundations. He noted the buried windows. He wrote, in a careful hand that grew less careful as the letter went on, that the lower 2 floors of the convent were entirely below the current ground level, sealed behind brick, and that the sisters refused him entry to them. He asked the Mother Superior a direct question. He asked her when the building beneath the building had been raised, and who had raised it. And according to his own letter, she answered him with a single sentence that he underlined 3 times. She told him that the house was not built. She told him that the house was uncovered. Uncovered, not built. That word does something to the whole picture, does it not? It tells you that the sisters of St. Wendrada did not think of themselves as the founders of anything. They thought of themselves as caretakers of something that was already there, something that had been buried and then dug back into the light. And if you have spent any time at all looking into the strange gaps in our accepted history, you already know that El Hollow is not the only place where this happens. All across the flat country, all across the old canal towns and the fen edges and the sunken commons, there are buildings that sit too low, with windows below the soil and foundations older than any town record allows. The official explanation is always the same. The ground rose. Silt accumulated. Roads were built up over centuries. It is a tidy explanation, and it works for one building. It works less well when you find a whole landscape of them, all sunk to roughly the same depth, all sealed at roughly the same level, as if a single event had passed across the entire county and left a tide line in the earth that nobody wants to name. I am going to name it, because you deserve to hear the idea spoken plainly, even if you decide to reject it. There is a story, older than any of us, that the world we live in now is not the first world to stand on this ground, that there was an earlier age, grander and stranger than our own, with architecture we could not build today and knowledge we no longer possess, and that this earlier age came to an end suddenly, catastrophically, buried under a wave of mud and water and forgetting, and that afterward, in the long grey years that followed, a new order rose up over the drowned bones of the old one, and set about the patient work of rewriting the record, not to lie for the sake of lying, to manage, to smooth the terror of an entire civilization waking up in the ruins of a world it could no longer remember. The buried floors of St. Wendreda's convent belonged to that older world. The sisters knew it. And the black in their eyes, I have come to believe, is the mark of exactly how much they knew. The letters in the crate let me build a picture of the order, piece by piece, though I want to be careful here, because the picture is incomplete, and some of it I have had to infer from the shape of the holes. St. Wendreda's was not a normal convent. The women who lived there did not teach, did not nurse, did not take in the poor, did not do any of the ordinary work that justifies a religious house to the community around it. They kept to themselves. They grew their own food behind high walls. And they performed one duty that the surrounding parishes both depended on and feared, a duty that appears again and again in the letters, in the careful evasive language people use when they are describing something they would rather not describe at all. The sisters of St. Wendreda watched. That is the word the letters use. They watched. They kept a vigil that never ended, in shifts, day and night, year upon year, generation upon generation. And what they watched, according to a letter from a frightened young curate named Bellamy, was not a relic, and not a tomb, and not an altar. What they watched was the sealed stairway that led down into the buried floors of the old world beneath the house. They were not there to worship. They were there to keep something down there from coming up. Now hold that thought against the photograph. 13 women standing on the steps, in the daylight, in 1891, all of them with eyes of solid black, all of them reflecting a domed building that does not exist on any map. What if the black in their eyes is not a wound and not a decoration? What if it is a consequence? What if you cannot spend your life staring down into whatever the old world left sealed beneath a sinking convent without it staring back into you and marking you and taking the ordinary human light out of your eyes and replacing it with something flat and dark and patient? I did not want to believe that when I first thought it. I am a paper person. I deal in provenance and dates and the boring truth of who owned what and when. But the more of the crate I read, the harder it became to hold on to the boring truth, because the boring truth kept running out at exactly the moment the story got interesting, as though someone had trimmed it there on purpose with a very sharp blade. The oldest document in the crate was not a letter. It was a single folded page, brittle as a dead leaf, copied by hand from something even older, and it laid out what the sisters called their rule. Every religious order has a rule. It is the set of vows and daily disciplines that governs the life of the house. Most rules are gentle things, full of prayer and labour and silence and charity. The rule of St. Wendreda was not gentle. It had 3 vows, and the first 2 were ordinary enough: poverty, obedience. It was the 3rd vow that stopped me cold, because it was not a vow of chastity or silence or stability. The 3rd vow was called the vow of the sealed eye, and the page described it in language so plain and so terrible that I read it 4 times before I could make myself believe it said what it said. A sister who took the vow of the sealed eye agreed to look. That was the whole of it, on the surface. She agreed to take her turn at the vigil, to descend the sealed stair, to stand before whatever waited in the buried dark of the old world, and to look at it directly and without flinching, so that it would remain known, and being known, would remain contained. The rule was explicit that the thing below could not be allowed to pass unwatched, not for a single hour, because in the hours it went unseen, it grew and reached and remembered its way toward the surface. So the sisters looked. Always. One of them, always, was looking, and the rule promised each new sister exactly what her looking would cost her. It said that the eye which beholds the old world takes the old world into itself. It said that after enough years of the vigil, the daylight would leave a sister's eyes, and the black would come. And this was not a curse, but a completion, the sign that she had become a true keeper, that she now carried the seal inside her own body, rather than merely standing guard over it. The black eyes in the photograph were not a horror that had been done to those women. They were a rank. They were the highest honour the order could bestow, and every one of the 13 had earned it. I want to slow down here, because this is the moment where a lot of people stop listening, and I understand why. It is easier to believe in a clumsy retoucher with a black brush than to believe that 13 women in the flat, wet country of the 1800s spent their lives staring into a buried civilization until their eyes went dark. I would very much like to believe the easier thing, but the plate would not let me. The original glass negative, the one wrapped in oilcloth and wax paper and altar linen at the bottom of the nailed crate, does not permit the easy explanation, and I need to tell you exactly why. Because this is the piece of physical evidence that broke the last of my resistance. A retouched print can be faked. Anyone with a brush and a lie can black out an eye. But a glass negative is the light itself. Frozen at the instant the shutter opened. Whatever is on the negative is whatever stood in front of that camera in 1891. And on the negative, the sisters' eyes are white. Perfectly, brilliantly white. The reverse of the black they show in the print, exactly as a solid black object should appear in a photographic negative. The eyes are real. The blackness is real. It was there in the room, in the light, on the day. No brush ever touched it, because there was nothing to add. The old world had already done the painting, years before, one long vigil at a time. And there is more on the plate, which I did not see until I had a proper light table and the patience of a desperate man. The reflected building, the domed structure that appears in every eye, is far sharper on the glass than in the print. On the negative I could count the windows of its great tower. I could see the smaller structures gathered at its base, a whole complex of them, a district, a quarter of a city that El Hollow says was never there. And in the largest, clearest reflection, in the left eye of the Mother Superior, whose name the letters give as Mother Aldith, I could see something that turned my stomach over. There were figures standing in front of the domed building. Small, pale, upright figures, arranged in a line on the steps of that impossible cathedral, in exactly the same formation as the sisters themselves. 13 of them, facing the same way. As if the reflection in the sisters' eyes was not a memory of a lost building at all, but a live image, a window looking through into the old world at that very instant, showing 13 other watchers standing on the far side of the glass, looking back. I need you to understand that I am not telling you these things to frighten you for entertainment. I am telling you because the pattern is consistent, and consistency is the one thing a hoax cannot easily manufacture across 130 years of separate documents written by separate frightened people who never met one another. The curate Bellamy, in 1874, wrote of the sisters' eyes going dark and called it, in his fear, a possession, and begged his bishop for an exorcist. The clerk Merrow, 11 years earlier, wrote of the buried floors and the uncovered house, and the Mother Superior, who told him the building was not built. The rule itself, copied from a source older than anyone could date, described the vow of the sealed eye and promised the black as a completion. And the plate, the cold indifferent glass, confirmed that the blackness was physically present in the light of 1891. 4 sources, 4 different hands, 4 different decades, all describing the same impossible thing from 4 different angles, none of them contradicting the others, all of them circling the same drowned centre like water going down a drain. That is not how lies behave. Lies drift apart over time. Only the truth stays in formation. The name of the town gave me my next thread, because names in the old country are rarely accidents, and El Hollow is a strange name for a place with no visible hollow in it. The land around it is flat as a table. There is no valley, no dell, no dip in the ground that would earn a settlement the word hollow, unless, of course, the hollow is not on the surface. Unless the hollow is what lies beneath, the great sunken emptiness of the buried old world, the drowned district that shows itself only in the black mirrors of 13 dead women's eyes. I began to suspect that the town had been named honestly, long ago, by people who still remembered what was under their feet, and that the memory had faded from the living even as it stayed fixed in the name, the way a scar stays on skin long after the pain that made it has been forgotten. I went looking for the founding of El Hollow itself, and that is when the record stopped being merely incomplete and started, very deliberately, to lie. Every town has a founding story, and most of them are dull: a river crossing, a market charter, a saint's well. El Hollow had one too, printed in the county histories, and it was as dull as they come. A drainage settlement, the books said, established in the early 1800s when the fens were cut and the water was pushed back and the flat black soil was opened for farming. New town, new ground, new people come from elsewhere to work the reclaimed land. That is the official birth of El Hollow, and it is a lie so clean and so complete that I almost admired it, the way you might admire a forged banknote for the quality of the paper. Because in the maps at the bottom of the crate, the maps that someone had hidden along with the plate and the letters, El Hollow already exists more than a century before it was supposedly founded. It sits there on a chart dated 1692, drawn in a style I did not recognize, and it is not a drainage settlement of a few dozen huts. It is a city. A great pale city arranged in rings around a central dome, and the dome on that map is unmistakably the dome that hides inside the sisters' eyes. I laid the 1692 map beside the modern survey of El Hollow, and I want to describe to you exactly what I saw, because it is the kind of thing you have to see for yourself before your mind will accept it. The modern town is a scatter of streets with no particular logic, the way small towns usually are, grown up crooked over the centuries with no plan behind them. Except that when I overlaid the old map, the crooked streets stopped being crooked. They lined up. Every lane, every property boundary, every awkward bend in the modern road followed precisely the outline of a building or a rampart or an avenue on the 1692 city. The town was not planless at all. The town was a fossil. It had grown in the ruts and shadows of the drowned city beneath it, its streets tracing foundations its own people could no longer see, the way grass grows greener over a filled-in grave. And at the dead centre of the modern town, where the old map showed the great dome, there was nothing on the modern survey at all, a blank. An open green with no path across it that the townspeople, I later learned, simply do not use and cannot say why. The hollow at the heart of El Hollow. The place where the cathedral of the old world went down into the earth, taking its light with it, leaving only a patch of grass that dogs will not cross and children are told, without any reason ever given, to stay away from. So who took the photograph? That question mattered more than I first understood, because a picture like this does not take itself, and the person behind the camera in 1891 had to have stood on those steps, looked at 13 women with black eyes, and pressed the shutter anyway. His name was Elias Ward, and I know this because he signed the plate, scratched faintly into one corner of the glass in the reversed backward hand of a man used to working with negatives. Elias Ward was a travelling photographer, one of the wandering platemen who worked the rural circuit in the last years of the century, going from parish to parish with a cart full of chemicals and a folding camera, making portraits of the living and the newly dead for whoever could pay. There were hundreds of men like him. Most of them left no trace at all. Ward left 3 traces, and each one is worse than the last. The first trace is a ledger entry in a neighbouring parish, dated 2 weeks before the Convent photograph, recording payment to a Mr. E. Ward for the making of memorial portraits. Ordinary business. The second trace is a letter, not from Ward but about him, written by the same frightened curate Bellamy who had begged for an exorcist years before. By 1891 Bellamy was an old man, and his hand shook, but his memory did not. He wrote that a photographer had come to the district asking after St. Wendradas, asking too many questions, wanting to know whether the sisters would sit for a portrait, and Bellamy wrote that he had warned the man off. He had told Elias Ward, in as many words, that the sisters of St. Wendrada did not sit for portraits, had never sat for portraits, because the vow of the sealed eye forbade any image of a keeper to leave the house. An image of the sealed eye, Bellamy wrote, was itself a kind of opening. A photograph of a keeper was a window that could be carried away and set up anywhere, and looked into by anyone, and through it the thing below could look back out into a world that had forgotten how to guard against it. Bellamy begged Ward to leave El Hollow and never return. Ward obviously did not listen. The photograph exists. He got his portrait. And that brings us to the third trace, which is the last record of Elias Warday that anyone ever made. The third trace is a coroner's note, and it is dated 11 days after the exposure of the Convent plate. It records the discovery of an unidentified man in a photographer's cart, found on the Fen Road 2 miles east of El Hollow by a farmer bringing his beasts in at dusk. The man was dead. There were no wounds on him, no sign of violence, no illness that the coroner could name. The horse was still in its traces, calm, cropping the verge, as though it had simply stopped and waited beside its master for however many hours it took someone to come along. And the coroner, a plain man writing a plain document with no interest in ghosts, recorded one detail that he clearly did not understand and included only because his duty was to record what he saw. The dead man's eyes, he wrote, were entirely black. He assumed it was some effect of death he had not encountered before, some pooling of the blood, and he moved on. But you and I know better now, do we not? Elias Ward photographed the sealed eye. He carried the window away in his cart. And somewhere on the Fen Road, in the dark, the window worked in both directions, and the thing below reached out through the image he had stolen and took the light out of his eyes, the way it had taken the light from all 13 of the sisters, and then it took the rest of him too. The vow was right. The image was an opening. Bellamy was right to be afraid, and Ward paid the price of the picture that you and I are now sitting here looking at. There is a version of me that wanted to stop here, to put the plate back in its oilcloth, and the letters back in their crate, and to quietly lose the whole thing in the back of a storage unit and let it be someone else's problem in 50 years. But I had already looked. That is the trap of this story, and I did not understand it until it had already closed on me. Once you have looked at the sealed eye, even in a photograph, even under a lamp in your own safe house 130 years later, you have taken your turn at the vigil, whether you meant to or not. And the vigil, once begun, does not like to be abandoned. I told you the Convent photograph was not the only image, and now I have to tell you about the others, because a single strange photograph is an anomaly, and an anomaly can be dismissed. A sequence of them, spread across 100 years, following a rule, is something else entirely. It is a record. Once I knew what I was looking for, I started finding the sisters everywhere, hidden in plain sight, in collections that had no idea what they were holding. A county archive had a stereograph card of St. Wendradas from around 1860. A dead antiquarian's estate produced a daguerreotype, older still, silver on copper, showing a single sister at an upper window. A parish magazine from the 1920s had reproduced a group portrait for a harvest festival feature, printed cheaply on pulp paper that had gone the colour of weak tea. And a local newspaper had run a photograph of the convent as late as the 1950s, under a small headline about the sale of church land. 5 images, nearly a century between the oldest and the newest. And in every single one of them, wherever a sister's face was turned toward the lens, the eyes were black. Think about what that requires. For the black eyes to be a hoax, someone would have had to tamper with a daguerreotype, a stereograph, a glass plate, a cheap pulp reproduction, and a mid-century newspaper halftone across 5 separate technologies, in 5 separate collections, over the span of 100 years, without ever being caught, and all to support a secret that nobody was telling and nobody was selling and nobody appeared to profit from in any way. That is not a hoax. A hoax has a point. A hoax has a hoaxer standing somewhere just off frame, waiting to be paid in money or attention or belief. This had none of that. This was just the same terrible fact, showing up again and again across every way we ever invented to freeze a face in light, patient and consistent, and utterly indifferent to whether anyone believed it. The sisters of St. Wendrada had black eyes. Every generation of them. From before photography existed, if the daguerreotype is any guide, all the way up to living memory. The vow of the sealed eye was not a story the order told about itself. It was a thing that happened to real women in that real house, for as long as the house stood. The daguerreotype troubled me most, and I want to explain why, because it contains a detail that the later images do not. In the group photographs, the sisters stand together, facing out, a wall of dark eyes. but the daguerreotype shows one sister alone at an upper window, and she is not facing out, she is facing down. Her black eyes are turned toward the ground, toward the base of the house, toward the buried floors, and her expression, insofar as a face of solid dark can have an expression, is not fear and not devotion. It is attention. Absolute, total, unbroken attention, the attention of someone who cannot look away and no longer wants to. She is at her vigil. The daguerreotype caught a keeper in the act of keeping, staring down through the floor of the world at the thing she had given her eyes to guard. And behind her, deep in the window's reflection, faint but present, is the dome. Always the dome. In every image, from every decade, whether the sisters face the camera or the earth, the drowned cathedral hangs in the glass of their eyes and the glass of their windows, waiting. The 1950s newspaper gave me the end of the convent, and the end is where the story turns from strange to frightening, because it is the point at which the modern world, our world, the world that is supposed to know better, quietly did exactly what the old order had done. It managed the terror, it smoothed the record, it made the problem disappear. The headline was small and the article was smaller. A few lines about the sale of church land, the closure of a religious house that had dwindled, the diocese said, to just a handful of elderly sisters, no longer able to maintain the property. The house was to be deconsecrated, the land was to be sold. The remaining sisters were to be moved to a care home in another county, where they would live out their days in comfort and quiet. It is a completely ordinary story. Old convents closed all the time in those years, their populations aged out, their buildings sold. Nothing about the article would make anyone look twice. Except that I had the crate, and the crate had one more letter, and the letter was dated the same month as the newspaper, and it was written by the last man who ever went inside St. Wendreda's convent. His name was Father Croft, and he was the priest sent by the diocese to oversee the deconsecration and the removal of the final sisters. He was, by his own account, a modern man, impatient with superstition, and he arrived at the house expecting a sad and simple task, a few old women and a lot of dust. What he found, he wrote, was 7 sisters, the last of the order, and every one of them had black eyes, and not one of them wanted to leave. They were not senile, they were not confused. They understood perfectly what he was there to do, and they told him, calmly and with one voice, that he must not do it, that the house could not be closed, that the vigil could not be broken, that if the last of them were carried away and the sealed stair left unwatched, the thing below, which had grown very strong in the long years while the world stopped believing in it, would come up. Father Croft, being a modern man, did not listen. He had the sisters removed, he had the house cleared, and on the last day, before the doors were sealed for the final time, he went down alone into the buried floors to see for himself what all the fuss had been about. His letter, which is the last document in the crate, breaks off in the middle of describing what he found at the bottom of the sealed stair. It does not finish the sentence. The ink simply stops in the middle of a word, and the rest of the page is blank. I tried to find out what happened to Father Croft. The diocese has no record of him after that year. No death, no transfer, no retirement, no grave. He simply ceases, the way Ward ceased, the way the founding of El Hollow ceases when you go back far enough, the way the ink ceases in the middle of his own last word. And I tried to find out what happened to the 7 sisters who were carried away to the care home in the other county. The care home has no record of them either. 7 elderly women with a very memorable feature, transferred in from a closing convent, and not one line of paperwork anywhere to say they ever arrived. They left St. Wendreda's in a diocesan car. 7 black-eyed keepers, torn from a vigil their order had held unbroken for longer than the town had officially existed, and then they fell straight through the floor of the record, as though the world had opened its own sealed stair and quietly taken them back down. By now you may be wondering why none of this is known. If there was a city under El Hollow, if there was an order of black-eyed keepers holding a vigil over the buried, why is it not in the history books? Why is it not on the maps? Why did I have to find it in a nailed crate in a leaking storehouse behind a dead office? And the answer to that question is, in a way, the real subject of everything I am telling you, because the disappearance of this story is not an accident or an oversight. It is the same act, repeated. The old order sealed the stair to keep the thing below from coming up. The new order, our order, the modern administrative world of surveys and diocesan records and county histories, sealed the story to keep the knowledge from coming up. Both are vigils. Both are seals. The only difference is that the sisters knew what they were guarding and stared it in the face with black eyes, while the clerks who erased El Hollow from its own history did their sealing with a filing cabinet and a fresh coat of official paint, and never once looked at what they were burying. I found the seam of the erasure in the maps, because maps are harder to lie in than words. A history can simply omit a thing. A map has to actively cover it, and covering leaves marks. The modern survey of El Hollow, the clean official one, has a small irregularity at its centre, at the blank green where the dome should be. The contour lines there do something no natural ground does. They go flat, perfectly, unnaturally flat, in a circle, as if the mapmaker had been given an instruction to represent that ground as featureless and had obeyed without asking why. And around the edge of that flat circle, when I examined a first edition of the survey rather than a later reprint, I found faint remnants of erased line work, the ghosts of features that had been drawn and then scraped away before printing. Someone had mapped the centre of El Hollow honestly, once, and then someone else had made them unmap it. The dome, the sunken district, the rings of the old city that the modern streets still trace, all of it had been on that first draft, and all of it had been removed, and the removal had been done in a hurry by a hand that did not quite manage to erase every line. The letters told me who gave the instruction, though not by name, which is itself the point. Woven through the correspondence, from Merrow in the 1860s all the way to Croft in the 1950s, there are references to a body the letter writers never name directly. They call it, variously, the office, the commission, the gentleman from the county. Once, memorably, in Bellamy's shaking hand, the correctors. It is always the same entity, and it always does the same thing. When someone in El Hollow notices too much, writes down too much, asks the wrong question in the wrong letter, the office arrives, not with violence, with paperwork. It reclassifies the buried floors as a drainage feature. It redates the convent to 1840. It rewrites the founding of the town as a fen reclamation. It takes the honest map and makes it flat. And then it goes away again, leaving behind a slightly smoother, slightly emptier version of the truth, until the next inconvenient person notices the next inconvenient thing, and the correctors return to smooth it once more. This is not a conspiracy in the way people usually mean the word, a room full of villains plotting in the dark. It is quieter and older and far more frightening than that. It is a maintenance schedule. Somewhere, someone has the job of keeping the old world buried, and they have had that job for a very long time, and they are extremely good at it. And the proof of how good they are is that until this crate survived its own burning, you had never heard the name El Hollow in your life. I want to be honest with you about my own fear at this stage, because I think you have earned that honesty by staying with me this far. When you spend weeks alone with documents like these, the boundary between the story and your own life begins to thin. I started noticing things, small things. My prints of the convent, which I had made from the original plate, began to look different to me in the mornings than they had the night before, though I told myself that was only tiredness and the changing light. I started avoiding the crate at night, and then I started avoiding the room the crate was in, and then one evening I realized I had gone 3 days without going into that room at all, and that I had begun, without deciding to keep the crate's door shut and a chair pushed against it. I was sealing my own stair. The old instinct, the one the sisters had built an entire order around, had woken up in me on its own, and it knew exactly what to do, and it had not asked my permission. That frightened me more than any document. Sick, because it meant the vow of the sealed eye was not a belief you had to be taught. It was a response the human animal already carries, folded up and waiting, for the day it finally sees the thing the sisters spent 3 centuries looking at, so that the rest of us would never have to. And here is the detail I've been holding back, the one that made me decide I had to tell this story out loud, rather than nailing it into a crate of my own and hoping the next person would be braver. On the original plate, in the reflection in Mother Aldith's left eye, there are 13 figures standing on the steps of the drowned cathedral, facing back through the glass. I told you that already. What I did not tell you is that I counted them again, later, after weeks of study, on a print I had made in my own darkroom from that same unchanging plate. And there were 14. I counted a third time. 14. A fifth time, a 10th time, in different lights, with different loops, sometimes alone and once with a friend I had begged to look who did not know what I wanted him to see. 14 figures now stand on the far steps where there had been 13. The plate has not changed. Glass does not change. But the reflection in the sealed eye has gained a figure since I first looked into it, a new watcher taking its place at the end of the line, facing back out through the window toward the world, and I do not think I need to tell you who I am afraid the 14th one is. I did the thing I should not have done. I went to El Hollow. I told myself it was for confirmation, that I needed to stand on the ground and see with my own eyes whether the crate had been telling the truth. But if I am honest, the vigil had simply pulled me the way it pulls everyone. And I went because after enough looking you cannot not go. The drive out was a long grey unwinding of flat fields under a flat sky, the kind of country where the horizon is so low and so far that you feel you are standing at the bottom of an enormous shallow bowl. And that feeling, I realized as I got closer, was not poetry. It was accurate. The land around El Hollow does dip, very slightly, over many miles, in a way you cannot see from any single spot, but can feel in the way water and roads and everything else leans gently inward toward the town. The whole district is the rim of a hollow so wide that a person standing inside it cannot perceive its shape. El Hollow sits at the center of a sunken place the size of a city, and the city, of course, is exactly what went down into it. The town itself was smaller and quieter than I expected, and wrong in a way I could not name for the first hour I spent there. The wrongness was in the streets. I had studied the overlay, the modern lanes tracing the drowned foundations, but knowing a thing and walking it are different, and walking El Hollow was like walking through a person wearing another person's clothes. The streets bent for no reason a street should bend. They widened suddenly where nothing needed the width and narrowed where the traffic needed room. They ended in blank walls and picked up again 3 houses along, following the memory of avenues no living eye had seen. And they all leaned, gently, unmistakably, toward the centre, toward the green, the way the whole country leaned toward the town. I did not need a map to find the hollow at the heart of El Hollow. I only had to stop resisting the tilt of the streets and let them carry me downhill toward the place they had all, secretly, always been pointing. The green was exactly as the survey promised, and far worse in person. A wide, flat circle of grass, unfenced, unmarked, ringed by the backs of houses that had all, every one of them, been built facing away from it. That was the first thing I understood standing there. Every window that could have looked onto the green had been bricked up or turned or shuttered. The town had grown up around this open space over centuries, and had spent those same centuries refusing to look at it, presenting it with a solid ring of blind walls and back gardens and turned shoulders. The people of El Hollow did not know why the dogs would not cross the green, why the children were warned off it, why no path had ever been worn across grass that offered the most obvious shortcut in the town. They did not know, but their houses knew. Their houses had been keeping the vigil in the only way houses can, by refusing, for 300 years, to give the hollow a single eye to look back through. I stood at the edge of that grass for a long time, and I did not step onto it, and I want you to understand that this was not courage and not caution, but something closer to instinct, the same folded response that had made me push a chair against a door in my own home. My body would not let me walk out onto the green. It simply would not. I would lift a foot and set it down again on the same spot, and after the 3rd or 4th time I stopped trying, and I noticed that my breathing had gone shallow and my eyes had begun, on their own, to sting and water, as though they were being asked to focus on something at a distance the eye is not built to reach. And in the very centre of the green, on the flat grass where the survey drew nothing and the old map drew a dome, the air did something I have tried many times since to describe and have never managed to describe well. It thickened. It aged. The light in that one circle of air was older than the light everywhere else, the way water at the bottom of a deep well is colder than the water at the top. And if I looked at the centre of the green directly for more than a moment, I had the unbearable sense that I was looking down, not across, that the flat grass was the surface of something very deep, and that the deep thing was, patiently and without any hurry at all, looking up. I asked about the convent in the town's one pub, carefully, the way you ask about a death in a small place. The reactions taught me more than the answers. The younger people had never heard of St. Wendredas and were mildly interested in the way people are interested in any old local trivia. The older ones went quiet. One woman, easily 80, put down her glass when I said the name and looked at me for a long moment with the flat assessing patience of someone deciding how much to say, and then she asked me one question. She asked me whether I had looked at the picture. Not a picture. The picture. She knew there was a picture, and she knew that looking at it was the thing that mattered, the threshold you either had or had not crossed. And when I said yes, I had looked, her face changed in a way I have not been able to forget. It was not fear. It was recognition, and under the recognition, something almost like pity. She told me that her grandmother had been a girl in El Hollow when the last sisters were taken away, and that her grandmother had said, all her life, that the town made a terrible mistake the day it let the convent close. That you do not remove the watchers, her grandmother used to say, just because you have stopped believing in the thing they watch. The thing does not need you to believe in it. It only needs you to stop looking. And then the old woman picked her glass back up and told me, kindly and without any drama at all, that I should go home, and that I should burn the picture, and that I should not, under any circumstances, come back to El Hollow after dark. I did 2 of those 3 things. You can probably guess which one I could not make myself do. I want to come back now to the question underneath all the others, the question that the eyes have been asking us since the very first frame of this. What did the sisters actually see? Not the dome, not the drowned city. Those are only the setting. What was the thing at the bottom of the sealed stare, the thing the vow of the sealed eye was invented to contain, the thing that took Ward and swallowed Croft's last sentence whole? I have thought about this more than is good for me, and I have come to an answer that I hold loosely, because it is the kind of answer that cannot be proved and can only be felt. But I believe it is close to the truth, and I believe the sisters would recognize it. The thing below is not a monster in the way we mean the word. It is not a creature that could be photographed or fought or killed. The thing below is the old world itself, not its ruins, not its buildings, its memory, the living, waking, unforgetting memory of everything that stood here before the great burial, pressed down into the earth under the weight of 3 centuries of official forgetting, and grown, in that pressure and that dark, into something that wants very badly to be remembered again. Think of what forgetting really is, on the scale of a whole civilization. When the old world went down, it did not simply end. Its cities were buried, but its memory had nowhere to go. You cannot bury a memory in mud. It has to be buried in minds, in the deliberate unknowing of generation after generation, in the maps that go flat and the histories that start late and the correctors who arrive with their paperwork to smooth the ground. Every one of those acts of forgetting is a shovelful of earth thrown onto the same grave. And the sisters understood, in a way our administrative world never has, that a grave that deep and that full does not stay quiet. The memory of the old world lies under El Hollow the way pressure lies under a fault line, and it presses upward, always, seeking any crack, any open eye, any unguarded image through which it can climb back into the light of the living and be known again. That is what the sisters watched for. That is what they gave their eyes to hold down. Not a beast, a remembering. The most patient and most bottomless remembering there has ever been, and the black in their eyes was the colour of standing at the lip of it, night after night, for a lifetime, and not letting it climb out through you. This is why the vow was a vow of looking and not a vow of prayer, and it is the single most important thing I understand about this whole affair. You do not hold back the memory of the old world by refusing to see it. Refusing to see it is exactly what feeds it, because every averted eye is another shovelful on the grave, another pound of pressure on the fault. The correctors, with their flattened maps and their redated stones, think they are containing the old world, but they are doing the opposite. They are burying it deeper, packing it tighter, raising the pressure under the seal. The sisters did the brave and terrible thing instead. They looked. They took the old world into their own eyes and held it there, in the light, known and therefore still and therefore contained, paying the price of the black so that the pressure had somewhere to rest that was not a fault line under a sleeping town. 13 women, and then 7, and then none, standing between the world that forgot and the world that would not be forgotten, holding the whole unbearable weight of it in 26 eyes gone dark with the holding. And when the last of them was carried away in a diocesan car and lost through the floor of the record, the vigil ended, and the seal was left to the houses, and their blind walls, and the dogs that will not cross the grass, and to the very slow, very certain rising of a memory that has now been climbing toward the surface, unwatched, for the better part of a century. I said earlier that El Hollow is not the only place like this, and I need you to hold that thought at its full weight now, because it is the part that should keep you up at night the way it keeps me up. All across the old country, all across the world if you look, there are sunken buildings and flattened maps and towns founded suspiciously late on ground that was suspiciously already shaped. There are blank greens that no one crosses, and central squares that no path traverses, and old quarters where the streets bend to trace foundations no living eye has seen. There are, in other words, other hollows, other drowned cities, other pressure points where the memory of the old world presses up against the thin skin of the forgetting we have thrown over it. And the terrible question, the one I cannot stop asking, is whether every one of those places once had its watchers too, whether there were other orders, other keepers, other vows of the sealed eye, in other houses over other stairs, all of them holding down their own piece of the buried world, and all of them, one by one, over the last century of our confident modern unknowing, quietly removed, deconsecrated, sold off, moved to care homes, and lost through the floor of the record, until the whole planet is now a field of sealed stairs with no one left at the top of any of them, and a memory the size of a lost civilization rising in the dark under all of it at once, looking up through every unguarded eye it can find, including, I have to tell you, yours, because you looked. I told you at the start that I was showing you a photograph of 13 women with black eyes, and I told you it was the front door, and you walked through it. Everyone who has watched this has walked through it. That is not a trick I played on you. It is simply the nature of the sealed eye, which does not care about screens or centuries or the comfortable distance you feel between your safe room and that convent step. An image of a keeper is a window that can be carried anywhere and looked into by anyone, and through it the thing below looks back. Ward learned that on the Fen Road. I learned it when I found the chair pushed against my own door. And you are learning it now, whether you wanted to or not, because you have spent the better part of an hour looking into 26 black eyes and the reflection they hold, and looking, as the rule says, takes the old world into itself. You have taken your turn at the vigil. The only question left is what you do with it. Let me tell you where things stand now, in my own house, with the crate, because the story did not end when I came home from El Hollow, and it has not ended as I sit here recording this for you. The chair is still against the door of the room where I keep the crate. I have added a second chair. I understand how that sounds. I understand that a man who barricades a room against a wooden box of old paper has, by any ordinary measure, lost his grip on the ordinary world, and there is a version of me that agrees, that wants to be talked gently back to the daylight and told it was all tiredness and imagination and the suggestible loneliness of a person who spends too long alone with the dead. I would take that comfort if I could. But the prints keep changing, and prints do not care what I would prefer to believe. The 14th figure in Mother Aldith's eye is still there. Last week I thought I counted 15, and I made myself stop counting, because I have come to understand that the counting is itself a kind of looking, and every look adds to the line. I have started to notice the black at the edges of my own sight, not in my eyes. I have checked, obsessively, in every mirror in the house, and my eyes are still my own, still ordinary, still lit. The black is not in them yet, but it waits at the corners of what I can see, a darkening just past the edge of vision that slides away whenever I turn to face it, the way the centre of the green slid away from my foot. When I read the letters now, late, under the lamp, the words at the edges of the page seemed to darken and swim, and once, only once, I looked up from Croft's unfinished final sentence, and for the length of a single heartbeat the whole room was the room in the photograph, grey and pressed and silent, and there were figures on the stairs, and their hands were folded low against their waists. And then the heartbeat passed, and it was only my house again, cold and real, with 2 chairs against a door. I do not know how many more of those heartbeats I have before one of them does not pass. I have thought a great deal about the old woman in the pub, and about the 1 instruction of hers that I obeyed and the 2 I did not. She told me to go home, and I went home. She told me to burn the picture, and I did not. She told me not to come back to El Hollow after dark, and I have not. Though I feel the pull of it every evening as the light goes, a tilt in me now that matches the tilt of those streets, everything in me leaning gently, patiently, toward that flat grey circle of grass and the deep old air above it. I did not burn the picture because I could not, and I have finally been honest enough with myself to understand why, and the reason is the most frightening thing I have to tell you. I did not keep the picture out of curiosity or scholarship or the collector's greed for a rare and terrible object. I kept it because somewhere in the weeks of looking, without deciding to, without noticing the moment it happened, I took the vow. Not in words. Nobody said any words. But the response folded up inside me woke all the way, and it looked at the sealed eye, and it recognized its duty, and it accepted it. Somebody has to watch. The sisters are gone. The correctors only bury it deeper. Somebody has to sit at the top of the stair with their eyes open and hold the old world still by knowing it, and the picture found its way out of that nailed crate and into the leaking storehouse and onto my stronger lamp because it was looking, the way it has always been looking, for the next pair of eyes willing to go dark so that everyone else's can stay lit. I am telling you all of this, and I am putting this out into the world where anyone can see it, and you may reasonably ask why. If an image of the sealed eye is a window the old world climbs through, I would take that window and show it to thousands of people at once. Am I not doing exactly what Ward did, only worse, only wider? I have wrestled with that, and here is the conclusion I have reached, and I offer it to you not as certainty but as the best I have. The correctors keep the old world buried by making sure no one looks. Their whole method, their entire ancient maintenance schedule, depends on the vigil being small, on the watchers being few and isolated, and easy to remove 1 dark day at a time. 13 women in one house can be closed. 7 can be carried off in a single car. 1 frightened man alone with a crate can be lost through the floor of the record and never missed. But 100,000 people who have all looked, all at once, all holding the same image of the same sealed eye in their own memory, spread across the whole world beyond the reach of any office or commission or gentleman from the county, that is a vigil that cannot be closed. That is a seal too wide to break. If the memory of the old world rises by being forgotten, then perhaps it can be held down by being remembered, truly remembered, by enough minds at once that no correcting hand can ever flatten all of them. So that is what I am asking of you, though I know how strange the asking sounds. I am asking you to remember. Not to be afraid, though you will be, and not to go looking for El Hollow, which I am begging you not to do, but simply to carry this, to hold the 13 sisters and their black eyes and the drowned dome in the reflection somewhere in the back of your mind, and to know that it was real, that they were real, that they stood a vigil for 300 years so that the ground under a sleeping town would stay quiet, and that when the last of them was taken away, the watching did not have to end, because it could pass, the way it has always passed, from one pair of eyes to the next. You looked. That means you are one of the keepers now. There are more of us than there have ever been. And, for the first time since Father Croft went down the sealed stair and did not finish his sentence, I think the thing below has reason to be afraid of us, instead of only the other way around. Among the letters in the crate there was one document that was not a letter at all, and I have kept it back until now because it is the only voice in this whole affair that belongs to a sister herself, and I wanted you to be ready to hear it. It is a single page torn from a diary, written in a young and careful hand, unsigned, undated, though the paper and the ink place it somewhere in the middle years of the 1800s. It is the account of a novice. A girl newly come to St. Wendrada's, not yet a full sister, not yet a keeper, writing in secret about the night she first took her turn at the vigil, and it is the most human thing in the crate, and the most unbearable. She writes that she was afraid, which she was not supposed to admit, and that the older sisters were kind to her, kinder than she had expected from women with such eyes, and that they told her the fear was right and good, and that a keeper who felt no fear was a keeper already lost. She writes that they led her down the sealed stair by candlelight, the older sisters going first, their black eyes needing no flame, and that at the bottom they told her she need only look, that looking was the whole of it, that she must not speak, and must not pray, and must not close her eyes, no matter what rose to meet them. And then she describes the looking, and here her careful hand begins to fail, the letters growing larger and looser down the page, the way a person's writing loosens as sleep or terror takes them. She writes that she looked, and that at first there was only the dark and the cold and the smell of deep earth. And then she writes that the dark was not empty, that it was full, that it was the fullest thing she had ever seen, crowded to bursting with a whole world, streets and towers, and the great dome lit from within, and people, so many people, going about lives that had ended before her grandmother's grandmother was born, all of it still happening down there in the pressed black dark, still real, still going on, waiting only for someone on the surface to look at it long enough to let it come back up into the day. She writes that it was beautiful. That is the word she uses, and it is the word that frightens me more than any of the others in the whole crate. She did not find a monster at the bottom of the sealed stair. She found a world, a lovely, lost, drowned world, reaching up toward her with a longing so vast and so patient that she understood, in that moment, why the vow was a vow of looking and not of fighting. You cannot fight a thing you pity. You can only look at it and hold it and refuse it the one thing it wants, which is to be let up. The diary page ends with a single line, written after a gap, in a hand gone almost to nothing. She writes that in the morning the other sisters looked at her and smiled, and told her that her eyes had begun to darken, and that she wept, not from fear, but because she already knew she would never again be able to look at anything, a sunrise, a face, a field of ordinary grass, without also seeing the beautiful drowned dark underneath it, wanting to come home. I have read that page more times than any other, and I think it is the key to the whole thing, because it tells you what the black eyes really cost, which was not sight and not life, but the ordinary world itself. The sisters gave up the ability to see anything simply, ever again. They spent their lives looking at the surface of the world and seeing, always, at the same time, the drowned thing beneath it straining upward, and they held it down, not with hatred, but with the terrible mercy of witnesses who will not look away from a suffering they cannot end. That is who was carried off in the diocesan car, not 13 frightening women with dark eyes. 7 exhausted keepers who had been holding a beautiful and bottomless grief still by the sheer discipline of their attention, for their whole lives, so that the ground under a sleeping town would not wake, and when they were taken away, the grief was left to reach upward unheld, and it has been reaching, gently, for a century, and it is very close now to the surface, and it is not angry. That is the part the correctors never understood, and the part that should frighten you most. It does not come up in rage, it comes up in longing, it only wants to come home. There is one last thing, and I saved it for the end, because it is the piece I understand least and fear most, and because it changes the shape of everything that came before it. I told you that Father Croft's final letter breaks off in the middle of a word, that the ink simply stops as he describes what he found at the bottom of the sealed stair, and that the rest of the page is blank. That is true, but it is not the whole truth, and I have not been able to say the whole truth until now, because I needed you to have heard all the rest first, so that you would understand what you are looking at when I finally show it to you. The page is not entirely blank after the ink stops. Under strong raking light held at just the right angle, the blank half of the page carries an impression, not writing, pressure. Something was laid against that page, hard, while the ink was still wet, and it left the ghost of its own shape pressed into the paper, the way a coin leaves its face on soft wax. And the shape pressed into the lower half of Father Croft's unfinished last letter is a face, a human face, eyes open, staring up out of the paper at whoever holds it to the light. And where the eyes should be, the pressure is deepest, 2 hard black wells sunk into the page, exactly the size and exactly the placement of the eyes of the sisters in the photograph. I have shown that page to the raking light many times now, and each time I understand a little more of what I think it means, though I wish I did not. Father Croft went down the sealed stair, a modern man who did not believe, and somewhere at the bottom of it he found the thing the sisters had watched for 3 centuries, and in the instant he found it, in the middle of writing the word that would have told us what it was, he stopped being able to write, because the eye that beholds the old world takes the old world into itself, and the taking is not gentle, and it is not slow when there is no vigil, no discipline, no vow to hold it at the lip. It came up through him all at once, and in the last act of the man he had been, before the black filled his eyes and the old world filled the rest of him, he pressed the page of his own letter against his own face, hard, deliberately, so that the shape of what he was becoming would be recorded, so that the next person to hold that page to the light would see a keeper's face staring up and would understand, without needing the finished sentence, exactly what waits at the bottom of the stair and exactly what it does to the eyes of anyone who reaches it without the sisters standing guard. Croft could not finish his warning in words. So he finished it in pressure, in the only language he had left, in the imprint of his own ruined face. And I have spent a long time now as the only living person who has read that final wordless sentence, and I am tired, and the black waits at the edges of my sight, and I think it is time I was no longer the only one. That is why the picture is in the document below, and the plate, and the maps, and the letters, and the raking light photograph of Croft's pressed and terrible page. I have put all of it where it cannot be nailed into a crate and lost. The correctors can flatten one map. They cannot flatten 100,000 memories. They can carry off 7 sisters in a single car. They cannot carry off everyone who has watched this to the end and taken the vigil into themselves the way you have. For 300 years the sealed eye was a secret held by a few dark-eyed women in one sinking house over one sealed stair in one forgotten town, and secrets that small are easy to bury, one deconsecration at a time. It is not a secret any longer. It is yours now, and the person next to you, and everyone watching in every place this reaches, all of us holding the same image at the same time, a vigil finally too large for any office to close. The sisters would understand what we are doing. I think, wherever the floor of the record took them, they would be glad of it. After 3 centuries alone at the top of the stair, they finally have relief. There are so many of us now. And the thing below, rising all this time through the long, unwatched century, is about to look up through the next open eye it finds and discover, for the first time since the world was buried, that the whole surface is watching back. So here is where I leave you, and here is the one instruction I will give you, because unlike the old woman in the pub, I am not going to tell you to burn anything, or to stay away, or to forget. I am going to tell you to keep watching. Not this video, the world. The ground under your own feet, the town you live in, the square that no path crosses, the old building that sits a little too low with its windows half swallowed by the soil, the flat green place that the dogs avoid and no one can say why. Now that you have taken the vow without meaning to, you will start to see them, these hollows, these sealed places, in your own streets and your own maps and your own suspiciously late founding stories. And when you see one, you will know what it is, and you will know what it means that no one is watching it anymore. That is the vigil now. It is not 13 women in one house. It is all of us, everywhere, with our eyes finally open, refusing to let the old world climb back up through our forgetting. The sisters held the line for 3 centuries in the dark and alone. The least we can do is hold it in the light and together. If you want to see the drowned cities the correctors flattened off the maps, the star-shaped foundations and the sunken quarters and the buildings older than the towns that pretend to have built them, I have put together everything I have found across the other hollows into one place, and it is waiting on your screen right now, because L Hollow was never the only one. It was only the one where a crate survived its own burning. Watch that next. Keep your eyes open, and whatever you do, do not stop looking. The moment we all look away is the moment it comes up, and this time there will be no one left to seal the stair.